The date is Saturday, March 27th, but that doesn't really matter because it's a podcast. Ultimately, we're just happy you're listening to this whenever, wherever you are. We have a guest today from Power for Puerto Rico. He's also a former Obama-Biden official, Federico A de Jesús. So really excited to have the senior advisor for Power for Puerto Rico on the show today. Federico, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Joshua, thank you for having me. I have big shoes to fill for Eric. I'm glad that you're doing this. Those big steel Puerto Rican flags at the Paseo Boricua are becoming interactive, so really glad to be here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'm actually wearing a Fiesta Boricua shirt with both banderas on it, funny enough. What part of the isla do you have roots in?
That's a good question. I was born and raised in San Juan and Guaynabo, so obviously San Juan, the capital, Guaynabo suburb. On my dad's side, my family is from Ponce, La Perla del Sur. And on my mom's side, it's a mix of Manatí and San Juan and a bunch of other places. 100% Boricua, no matter where you're born, and happy to talk about the island and their issues.
We had Erika Gonzalez from Power for Puerto Rico on the show. In previous episodes, we were breaking down the Puerto Rico elections, the Puerto Rican electorate. So it was a really cool conversation. She shared a little bit about what Power for Puerto Rico is. But for anybody that's listening that hasn't heard that episode, can you tell us a little bit about the organization? What should we know about Power for Puerto Rico?
Sure. So Power for Puerto Rico was born out of the crisis of Hurricane Maria, where the neglectful federal and often local response really left the longest blackout in U.S. history. A lot of people were out of power in Puerto Rico for a year. But the crisis also demonstrated the powerlessness in the relationship with the federal government. So that's why, between the electricity and people actually moving forward in their communities, not waiting for government aid to come, really showed how you can empower yourselves. So power for Puerto Rico really means just that, not just electricity, but just empowering people. We're a coalition that includes several national and local groups like Hispanic Federation, Sierra Club, Center for American Progress, and a lot of local and state community groups like Puerto Ricans in Minnesota. We have the People for Puerto Rico from Philadelphia, Alianza for Progress, and others in Florida. So we're really trying to build a movement here, and we're advocating for disaster relief and policies at the federal level that empower Puerto Rico to address structural problems. I know that sounds like a lot, but that's kind of what our wheelhouse is all about.
What's the quick rundown of the Puerto Rican Self-Determination Act, Federico? What should we know about this bill?
Sure. So before we get to the legislative substance, I think it's important to segue right from where Power for Puerto Rico was born out of. I think that not only Hurricane Maria, but Promesa, the fiscal crisis, the 15-year-long recession Puerto Rico's been in, really shown a light to the United States and people in the States that really weren't familiar with Puerto Rican issues, except maybe once a year they saw the Puerto Rican Day Parade, or maybe Vieques was a hot topic, but they really weren't familiar with what's going on in the island. I still think it's a challenge because Puerto Rican issues can be complicated. And so I really appreciate the props to our Twitter feed because it's challenging to really condense so much complication into 143 characters. This bill, the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act, was born out of community activism. The press conference that you mentioned, we had more than 100 national and local grassroots organizations from the island and the states that were pushing for a self-determination bill that really broke with how Puerto Rico's status conversation has been had in the past. Puerto Rico has held 6 non-binding referendums, which really are just beauty contests because Congress isn't obligated to listen or to implement the results. Sometimes Congress has tried to force a specific solution upon Puerto Ricans, but have never really consulted the Puerto Rican people as to the options and the consequences of those options. So Puerto Ricans have been arguing amongst ourselves for years, but we really haven't had Congress, who holds the power and the sovereignty over Puerto Rico, to tell us what it's willing to offer the people. And we're trying to force that conversation through a grassroots level. Before this conversation was really dominated by the political parties in the island, which obviously still have to have a role, right? But it shouldn't exclusively be about the politicians or the parties. It should be about the people, and that's what we're trying to do. In terms of the bill, it's actually, being presented in the press as something really new, and it does have new aspects, but the fundamental part of this is based on a 2006 bill that Ted Kennedy and Bob Menendez, when he was arriving in the Senate, and Luis Gutierrez, your hometown former congressman, and Nidia Velázquez introduced this bill, basically not to force anything on Puerto Rico, but to recognize that Puerto Rico has the inherent authority to call a status convention that would be elected, and to create a mechanism for Congress to respond. So it wouldn't force Puerto Rico to do anything, but if the island and its elected legislature decide to call for something like this, then it would kick in a congressional bilateral commission that will really negotiate and establish the parameters of, okay, well, if Puerto Rico does wish to become a state, what does that mean? Well, how long would the transition last? When would federal taxes kick in? What would happen to the debt? Would there be reparations? Would the Jones Act continue under the statehood? Would language be an issue, right? Because in Puerto Rico, Spanish is the language of schools, the government, and the courts. Even though the island has two official languages, English and Spanish, the lingua franca in Puerto Rico is Spanish. So would that change? It had to in New Mexico and in Hawaii. We're in the 21st century. Some people say that it couldn't. Under independence, with U.S. citizenship, continue in the island. Right now, we're natural born U.S. citizens, right? We're not immigrants, even though we have the immigrant experience culturally sometimes. That's a unique part of Puerto Rico. And what would happen in between free association or greater autonomic Commonwealth relationship that's not colonial would entail? All of those questions sometimes are left to the propaganda that politicians in the island and sometimes in Congress like to spew on Puerto Ricans, but never has officially Congress said, yeah, you know what, this is what we're willing to do for you, and negotiate the terms, and then offer the people a final chance to vote, and then have Congress actually abide by that vote. This bill is binding. This means that if Puerto Ricans vote, Congress shall approve a resolution implementing the result of a final referendum. So all of those elements have been missing from the conversation, and this is really about empowering people to make an informed decision.
When I hear free association, independence, statehood, I get a little bit confused. Because, I mean, independence, that's pretty clear. Statehood, clear. But free association, can you break down what that would mean? Because when I hear free association, I think independence. What's that distinction?
You know, people think they know what statehood is, again, or independence. People that think that under independence, all of the McDonald's are going to leave the island and the dollar's not going to be circulating and we're going to be starving to death. You know, those myths about what people think are independence or statehood should be addressed in this convention or any other official process, right? But those in between options, what would greater autonomy for Puerto Rico mean without being under the territorial clause? That's in part what we need this congressional commission to tell us, right? Because some people want, for example, to control Puerto Rico's borders. That's not unprecedented. The Northern Marianas, another U.S. territory that is actually a Commonwealth, they do that, right? So what would that look like? Right now, there are Mexicans coming into Puerto Rico to help grow coffee. And you would think with so much unemployment, why is that? So would Puerto Rico actually want to bring in more people, right? Sometimes when people talk about controlling your immigration system, it was viewed as trying to prevent Dominicans and Cubans and others who immigrate regularly to Puerto Rico out. But with the outflow of Puerto Ricans to the mainland and other countries, we have a shortage of workers in Puerto Rico, either because they don't want to work for the low poverty wage, minimum wage, or because simply they have other aspirations, right? So for Puerto Rico to have more power over its economic and internal affairs is crucial. And what would those details look like? Again, Puerto Ricans have debated it for centuries, right? So what would free association mean? I don't consider it independence. Some people use that, I think, to scare off people. I think that when you share, for example, you can be a republic, you can have representation in the United Nations, but if your defense and your currency and other systems are still shared with the United States, but you hold national sovereignty over basically all of the other areas, for example, customs, then that's a different type of relationship, more akin to maybe the European Union, for example, than a sovereign independent republic or kingdom like, Saudi Arabia, for example, or the Dominican Republic. So again, those concepts are sometimes hard for people to grasp. And that's in part why we need Congress to step in and be part of the solution and neither dictate nor ignore the issues that Puerto Rico is currently facing. And the reason that this is complicated is because if it were Washington, D.C., right, a lot of people talk about, well, let's make D.C. and Puerto Rico a state. It's a voting right issue. And maybe we would have 4 Democratic senators. Well, number one, Puerto Rico, unfortunately, is going through a very conservative phase where they can't even band together to prohibit conversion therapy, for example. You had a Christian party that got 8%, which is a lot for Puerto Rican standards. And I'm not saying Puerto Rico wouldn't be a democratic state. I'm just saying that it's not a slam dunk, and people need to look at this further. So in the case of DC and Puerto Rico, DC is the capital of the nation where Americans live, where they pay federal income taxes, where they don't have their own national identity or their own tax system, or their own constitution, for example. DC's budget has to be approved by Congress. So the limited autonomy that Puerto Rico had was not only a recognition of Puerto Rico being basically a Latin American country under the US flag, but also this issue of, well, this is our country, this is yours, but the US holds sovereignty over you. How are we going to work that out? So Puerto Rico was allowed to form its own constitution in 1952, which inaugurated the Commonwealth, which basically what changed, Puerto Rico was able finally to raise its own flag, which was illegal. Before, in the first 50 years of American occupation. We got our own constitution. And Congress actually limited its power. Before the Commonwealth, Congress and the president could veto laws unilaterally approved by the Puerto Rican legislature. But unfortunately, after Puerto Rico got bankrupt and the Promesa law was imposed by the federal government, a junta was imposed on Puerto Rico that can veto the budget and other decisions and laws implemented by the duly elected officials from the island. So that really turned Puerto Rico's colonial legacy bare, whereas before there was a debate over whether Puerto Rico was a colony of the United States. Nobody really disputes that. Nobody serious anyway disputes that. And so we're really not trying to leave anybody out of the process. Some Commonwealth supporters feel that they're being left out because the current status isn't included. And what I say to them is, look, the Commonwealth Party always said they wanted to enhance and improve Commonwealth. Let's just do it in a way where Congress doesn't give us power that it then takes away, and then we're back in this position where we're the oldest colony in the world. I know that's a very long-winded answer to a short question, but those are the issues, again, that Puerto Ricans have been debating passionately amongst ourselves, mainly in Spanish and in the island, and now the diaspora is part of the conversation. And we want to force Congress to answer these questions and not let Puerto Ricans be on the wayside while the federal government treats us unfairly, from things over Medicaid, again, the Jones Act that makes things more expensive in Puerto Rico because only U.S. ships can be used in interstate commerce. And so all of these issues like the debt and reparations need to be addressed.
The PR Self-Determination Act isn't the only bill that's been introduced to Congress, but a few days before the PR Self-Determination Act was reintroduced, Representative Darren Soto, who's a Democrat from Florida, and Representative Jennifer Gonzalez, Puerto Rico's non-voting member of Congress, who's also a Republican, introduced new legislation that basically advocates for Puerto Rico statehood. It's called the Puerto Rico Statehood Admissions Act. What would you say the distinctions are between both of these acts? And is the Puerto Rico Statehood Admissions Act tied to the recent statehood referendum in the past Puerto Rico election?
Sure. So again, before going into the details of the bill, where did this Statehood Admission Act come from? So several bills were introduced basically since the 2010s on a Statehood Admission Act, even though maybe random legislation on that could have been introduced decades past, but with serious momentum. It began in the 2010s. And several versions have been bandied about. Congressman Darren Soto from Florida, the first Puerto Rican from Florida, Democrat, he introduced a bill in the last Congress that would have made Puerto Rico a state without a referendum, before the referendum in November, by the way, and it would have made it a state in 3 months with no transition. So sometimes these bills from both sides of the aisle, right? Democrats and Republicans do these messaging bills to either please donors or please constituencies. But this is, I think, the first time that we're really seeing a serious discussion basically on both bills, right? I have my preferred choice, which is the Self-Determination Act, and I respect the folks that are for the statehood bill. I think that the basic difference is that the Self-Determination Act is inclusive of all non-territorial options, and the statehood bill obviously just wants to make Puerto Rico a state, regardless of what Puerto Rico wants. And you would say, well, Federico, but didn't Puerto Ricans vote 52.5% in November in the elections to become a state? And my answer is yes, that number exists and it's real, and whoever denies it, I don't know what Kool-Aid they're drinking, but that's not the whole side of the story. Why is that? Because you have this movement, the New Progressive Party in Puerto Rico, that pushed for that referendum that says that statehood is a civil rights issue, a voting rights issue, right? And yet they kicked out Commonwealth, independence, and free association supporters off of the ballot in that referendum and left statehood as the only choice. So if your choice is a piece of bread that might actually have some fungi on it or starve to death, I think between something and nothing, people usually pick something, right? So it's unfair to say that statehood enjoys a majority support in Puerto Rico, number one, when other options weren't on the ballot. Number two, when the U.S. Justice Department rejected that referendum, twice actually, in 2017, when there was a boycott. But this time there couldn't be a boycott because it was the day of the election. And the other side is that, yes, you have that 52.5 in favor of statehood, but there's another number that people don't talk about, 67%. What does that 67% represent? All other people that voted against the current governor who was for statehood, take it or leave it. That 67% won a majority in the legislature, multi-party for the first time. For the first time, there's an all-women Senate in Puerto Rico with a Afro, openly lesbian contingent, labor, some extreme Christians, some atheists, a lot of diversity. So that 67% voted for something else that wasn't statehood, no matter if you want it or not. And there are statehood supporters in that 67%. This Self-Determination Act isn't an anti-statehood bill. In fact, a new representative from one of those new leftist parties in Puerto Rico, Jose Bernardo Marquez, he's pro-statehood, and he's for the Self-Determination Act because he says the U.S. government will not look upon a result of a referendum in Puerto Rico with legitimacy if it wasn't inclusive, right? That just makes common sense. And a lot of people criticize these Justice Department rejections of the referenda because they were the Trump Justice Department. And let me make clear that those reports from the Justice Department, yes, they were from Bill Barr and Jeff Sessions, that were Trump appointees, but they quoted Obama-era White House task force reports saying that any referendum in Puerto Rico that leaves out other options wouldn't be legitimate for the Obama White House. So to say that this is some Trumpian, racist, anti-Puerto Rican report is just flat out wrong. And people in Chicago know that that Obama wasn't anti-Puerto Rican, even though we may not have agreed with all of his policies. He definitely wasn't a racist against our people. So I think that all of those myths need to be cleared out. And that 67% that's promoting diversity is also promoting this bill. This wasn't born out of the political parties in Puerto Rico, but we do have the House Speaker of Puerto Rico, who's for Commonwealth, for enhanced Commonwealth. We have the pro-independence party former candidate and that party endorsing this bill, Juan Dalmau, who for the first time got 14%. So let me make that clear. The statehood governor got 33%, and two independence candidates combined for the first time in history got a total of 30% of the vote. So to say that all Puerto Ricans are now stateholders really negates that 67% that's for diversity. So that's kind of where the two bills fall from. One would make Puerto Rico a state contingent upon another statehood yes or no referendum, but this time it would be binding. So kudos to them for doing a binding bill. And our bill is binding as well, but it would just include all options. It's been criticized for being a little bit more complicated, but just think, how was America born? 1776, there was a constitutional convention, right? This isn't unprecedented. And so for important decisions, why do we want to have delegates as opposed to the people directly decide? Well, no, again, the people will decide at the end and at the beginning. They elect the delegates and they will either reject or accept any of the alternatives posed to them in an informed way. But it's all about who drafts the definitions. In the past, politicians and the political parties drafted the definitions, skewed them in order to manipulate voters, or congressional bills, again, tried to decide for Puerto Rico, would impose those definitions upon them. Now it would be Congress and Puerto Rico in a bilateral manner negotiating for the people to know what's acceptable to both sides, right? And in a democratic way. So again, I'm biased for my bill, but I do have to give the stateholders credit that this time they actually introduced a binding statehood yes or no referenda. I just think that saying to people, oh, if you're opposed to statehood, you can vote no, and that's inclusive. No, imagine an election where Trump was the only candidate and you could just say yes or no. Well, that's not fair. You need to be able to proactively vote for your choice. So self-determination is that. It's the freedom to choose, your own destiny. In this case, what relationship we want to have, if any, with the United States of America that invaded Puerto Rico in 1898 and took over Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam, and they still haven't left Guam and Puerto Rico, and that's what we're trying to decide.
Looking at these two bills, how would you describe the bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress?
Sure. So let's be straight. The Puerto Rico Statehood Act Statehood Admission Act does have more bipartisan support than the PR Self-Determination Act, although it does have a Republican senator from Mississippi, Roger Wicker, who's actually been an ally of Puerto Rico on some issues, right? I'm not a conservative, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there is some bipartisanship here, but really the statehood bill has more bipartisan support, which makes you wonder, if you're a progressive, why are all these Republicans wanting to make Puerto Rico a state? What do they know that I don't? And I think this other bill, the Self-Determination Act, will garner more bipartisan support. It has 85 senators and members of Congress. It has Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Sherrod Brown, a lot of progressive champions, but also centrists like Robert Menendez, right? And a conservative like Roger Wicker, and obviously Alexandria Ocasio, who's the progressive champion, and Nidia Velázquez. So it's a bill that reflects the diversity that we're trying to promote in the self-determination of the people of Puerto Rico.
Would you say the PR Self-Determination Act is seeing more collective support from the diaspora, or would you say the Puerto Rico Statehood Admissions Act is receiving more support from Puerto Ricans in the diaspora?
You know, it really depends on how you measure that. We, again, see that statehood admissions bill as something driven by the government of Puerto Rico, the Republican delegate in the House, Jennifer Gonzalez, who's from the New Progressive Party in Puerto Rico. Wrap your head around that, by the way. In Puerto Rico, we don't have Democrats or Republicans. We have the Commonwealth Party, which is the Partido Popular Democrático, and the New Progressive Party, which is the statehood party that elected a Republican to Congress, right? So wrap your head around that. But those are the people, and the governor and the previous governor were supporting this bill. But the Self-Determination Act, even though, again, there have been politicians from all persuasions in Puerto Rico that support it, it's mainly driven by grassroots support, not just from the organizations I mentioned earlier, like Alianza for Progress, Puerto Ricans in Minnesota. We have Puerto Ricans in Arkansas and Ohio supporting this. But we've also been able to get grassroots supports from people like Indivisible, like the Sunrise Foundation, like the National Urban League. So we have immigrant organizations like FLIC, the Florida Immigrant Coalition. So we also want to bring this conversation outside of just Puerto Rico and just Puerto Ricans in the diaspora to educate progressives, conservatives, libertarians, and all Americans from all walks of life, right? Because the nation that we live in the United States is founded upon the principle of consent by the governed, right? And also a pluribus unum, of many one. That's why the name Indivisible of that grassroots organization is formed, right? One nation under God. Whether you like the under God part, it's one nation, right? In the case of Puerto Rico, it would be more like Quebec. It would be a pluribus duum. And I don't want to get into my Latin class geeks out there, but basically, Puerto Rico is a nation sociologically. It has an Olympic team, a national language, a national anthem, and flag. And that's fine, but you have to accept that, right? If Puerto Rico will become a state, will there be an Olympic team? Some people say, well, the Olympic Committee is a nonprofit. The government can force them. Yeah, but there's something called the U.S. Amateur Sports Act from the 70s that actually prohibits any state to have its own Olympic team. So again, people need to know these little details that might seem random. But the point, again, is that there's diversity in this push. We don't have millions of dollars in lobbying and consultants or PR firms. It's a community effort. And I'm actually surprised that in the tally, we have 85 members of Congress supporting this, and they have 57. And that might change. They'll get people to support it. We'll get others to support our bill. The important thing is that discussion is being had and that there are alternatives out there. And so I think that when this year started, Democrats wanted to get rid of the filibuster, make Puerto Rico and DC a state. And there weren't people questioning that. Now there's a conversation about, well, wait a minute, there might be a different approach that is inclusive and that's progressive and fair and transparent. And that's kind of what we're trying to make people realize, that there's a little bit more than just one non-binding referenda that excluded all other options.
To wrap up our conversation, we ask our guests what they're obsessed with. So just curious to hear from you, what are you obsessed with today? It can be related to Puerto Rican culture. It does not have to be, but, movies, TV shows, whatever, books. What are you obsessed with today?
Well, obviously, anybody who listens to this podcast will realize that I'm obsessed with Puerto Rican self-determination. Other than that, I'm actually quite fascinated by an unfortunate growing xenophobia in Puerto Rico that's, again, complex. But we've had an influx not only of those, Americans coming in and evading taxes, but also a lot of tourists swarming in. You've seen footage from Miami, people destroying property and getting into fights, not wearing their masks, obviously. And in Puerto Rico, we've had an influx of those types of tourists. Unfortunately, we've had people coming in and disrespecting locals, not wearing masks or respecting social distance, and that's wrong. And the authorities really haven't arrested them. But some of the online criticism, unfortunately, has been a little racist, right? Because a lot of the women are African American. They wear clad clothing, and Puerto Rico is a very conservative society. And you see a lot of comments saying, well, it's not that type of tourist, or why do they have to behave that way? And, people who think that we're Latin and there isn't racism really don't know Latin culture. And so I'm not saying that all Puerto Ricans are racist. In fact, I think we're very welcoming people, but unfortunately, the loudest voices online get listened to the most. And I fear that there's a growing rejection of others. Puerto Rico is a very welcoming place. Again, there's some Mexicans that are coming and growing coffee and tomatoes in Puerto Rico that's very needed. And so in the States, I'm very pro-immigrant and pro-choice and anti-hate. And I have to be consistent and support that type of social policy in the island as well. And so I don't think that these religious groups that are trying to prevent the banning of conversion therapy are on the right side of history. And I hope that Puerto Rico falls into that right side of history, because you really can't go to the United States and demand civil rights when you're denying them at home. So that's kind of what my main obsession over this is about. It's also related to self-determination, but it's a more cultural way of analyzing it and trying to separate the economics and the politics that are crucial. But it's all about people and how they relate to each other, right? So that's kind of what has my head wrapped around. Unfortunately, I'm not going to conventions or speaking engagements like I used to. It's all online. And I'm really obsessed about going out and having fun when we're all vaccinated and it's safe to do so. So that we can have a social life and interact people, in meaningful and fun ways. So that's kind of what's been on my mind. And hopefully after the pandemic, I won't be as obsessed with Puerto Rico self-determination, and we can come back and talk about movies and books and other stuff. I don't want to have people give the impression that I'm putting Puerto Rico down. I'm a very proud Puerto Rican. And in fact, Puerto Rico, under Governor Garcia Padilla, which I argue was the last constitutional governor of Puerto Rico, he actually passed two important bills. Number one, prohibiting discrimination in the workplace, privately as well, against the LGBTQI community plus, and also banning any discrimination against immigrants and giving them driver's license. So I'd really like to go back to those days. It wasn't that long ago. That was in 2015. And so let's just remind people that we're having this influx of outsiders to the island, and it could be controversial, but it's about people, and we should treat them as, Puerto Ricans usually treat people, with welcoming arms. And that's really what I would like, no matter what the status debate turns out to be.
Federico, how can people keep up with you? How can they keep up with Power for Puerto Rico? Give us all the things, websites, social media. How can they stay up to date?
Sure. So you mentioned prpolicy.org. That was a campaign for hashtag Show Us Your PR Policy during the presidentials to force candidates of both parties to have a Puerto Rico policy. So take a look at that. Take a look at Power for the number 4, Puerto Rico.com, not .org. The domain was taken. You can follow me at F de Jesús Febles. I'm sure that you'll put it under the screen because it's tough to remember, but this is a podcast. So at FDEJSESUSFEBLES. My mother has a last name. Puerto Ricans are really tight with having two last names. My company, FDJ Solutions, at Twitter at FDJ Solutions DC, and at fdjsolutions.com, our website. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. And for Power for Puerto Rico, we're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and would really like to engage you. Again, we're not for any status option. We really want to empower all Puerto Ricans to this conversation, and also the economic and political discussion on a lot of other issues that face the island and the U.S. So hopefully we'll be able to engage, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you, Josh.
All right, Federico A. de Jesús, thank you so much for being on the Paseo podcast. Appreciated the insights, the knowledge, and the context that you gave us. Thanks for being on the show.
Muchas gracias.
We are continuing our discussion on the issue of Puerto Rico status, the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. And we have two guests here that actually did some really good research on the temperature on the island, on where people stand on the issue of Puerto Rico status. So today I'd like to welcome Giovanni Pagán Vélez and Andrés Rodriguez Brauer. They were two members of the research team that were responsible for a recent study on Puerto Rican status preferences. I believe the title is a bit longer than that, but if you type in Data for Progress in Google, Puerto Rican status preferences, the doc will come right up. You won't regret it. Read the whole thing. We're going to dive into a few aspects of the report. But before we get into that, Giovanni, Andrés, welcome to the Paseo podcast. How are you today?
Thank you for having us. We're doing pretty good right now. I'm speaking to you right now from Santurce, Puerto Rico, as you can see from the shrubbery right here. Can't complain. It's a nice day outside.
Right on. Andrés, are you in Puerto Rico as well? Where are you at?
No, I'm currently visiting some friends in New Jersey. I've been in the city for most of the pandemic, New York, that is. But yeah, had the chance to get away from a tiny apartment for the weekend, birthday weekend. So excited to have that opportunity, but of course, looking forward to the next chance to go to the island as well.
Nice. All right. Well, it's really good to have you both here. Before we get into the nitty gritty of this research that you both were a part of, what should our audience know about you? Giovanni, why don't we start with you since you're in Santurce? I'm being biased. I love Santurce.
Yeah. Well, actually, the first thing that people should know, I was born in Santurce, Puerto Rico, but my family lives in Toa Baja. I currently work as an economist, but I do a lot of other things on the side.
Andrés, what about you?
Yeah. So, like Giovanni, actually, I don't think I noticed this, but I was also born in Santurce. Seems like everyone was born in Santurce, but yeah, I was raised in Trujillo Alto, Puerto Rico. Lived there until 17, 18 years old, before I moved to New York for NYU, where I majored in economics and politics.
So can you both give us, and whoever wants to take this, Giovanni, Andrés, give us a top level view. The research that you all did for Data for Progress, full name, Puerto Rican Status Preferences, simulating decolonization through ranked choice voting. So I feel like there's a lot in that headline already. What is the synopsis of this research? And again, we'll go into some of your key findings, but what's the high level view?
Okay, so I'm going to jump into one thing that needs to be said before.
Sure.
So Andrés and I have for a long time discussed the issue of status, as everyone in Puerto Rico does. But one thing that we found as a common trait was that there was not accurate data what people thought, one, and two, all the wording of the questions usually had one bias or another. So for example, certain questions of status didn't include certain options or frame certain options in a certain way. So we wanted to develop a process that was fair and included all the options, right? So back in September, we reached out to some folks in Data for Progress to kind of think about a way to do this through ranked choice voting. And for those of you at home that are not familiar with ranked choice voting, the way that it works is that you rank what you want. So let's say you have, you need to choose between beverages, and you have Coca-Cola, Sprite, and orange juice, and you like orange juice the most, you put it 1. You like Coca-Cola the second most, you put it 2, and you like Pepsi the most, and you put the third most, you put it 3, right? And that's the way it works. You can do that for basically a lot of other options, and that's one thing that we did for status. So in the process of this, we pulled a few other things, but this particular study focused on status. And some of the main findings that we found was that 65% of Puerto Ricans in the island, or at least the ones that we polled voters, supported an option that is not colonial, either statehood, independence, or free association, right? And then we also find that 83% support an option that is not the status quo. So that includes what is usually called el mejorado, or the improved Commonwealth, which is still a form of the Commonwealth status, but has certain reforms that are, somewhat differently defined depending on who you ask. The point being that there's a broad consensus among the Puerto Rican electorate that folks want an option of status that is not the current one. And that's where we take it off, and that's where we want to get the ball rolling, because usually in the United States, the conversation is about Puerto Ricans are divided, Puerto Ricans, don't know what they want. But the fact is, a lot of people know what they want, and all of them coincide the fact that they don't like the status quo and they want that to change.
Going into that, I wanted to touch on some of the key findings that we found on the study. So first of all, our results are very much in line with historical referendums, which somewhat put the question just how much the actual preferences have changed over the last few years. And though we do find that independence is growing relative to where it has stood historically, and we'll have more on that. That said, the statehood has a plurality in terms of first choice preferences, and this becomes a majority once other alternatives are eliminated and narrowed down into the two final most preferred options. And then lastly, we want to remind everyone that any decolonization process will be influenced by the ballot design and the options that are available and the details of each option, including transition plans. No? So these are all things to keep in mind while going through these numbers.
Looking at this research, if statehood is the only option that people can choose from, that will get not necessarily a majority in terms of 50%, but it will get a majority of people deciding that that's the best path forward for Puerto Rico. Am I hearing that correctly? Not ranked choice voting, but just if it's just statehood is put in front of them and they have to choose yes or no, they're most likely going to choose statehood. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, that's also what we saw in the 2020 referendum. No, and there's criticisms to be had, but I think also as our piece shows, as far as Puerto Rican referendums go, it's one of the ones with the least controversy, despite the amount of controversy that it also entailed, and more than it being a testament to how great the process was, it's a testament of how divisive and confrontational all the previous process have been, and it's something to keep in mind with why there's so much animosity between all sides when discussing something like process. You know what I mean? We're not even arguing about what the actual option should be, but even the question of how should the process be handled has long been historically divisive. No, and like Giovanni was saying, this very often was used as a motivation to say, well, we can't decide for Puerto Ricans, so we can't do anything at all. No, so this is why Giovanni very correctly pointed out that the grand majority of Puerto Ricans want change in some way or form, and simply saying they're divided and they don't agree on anything is not it's not fair to Puerto Ricans. Like, imagine if we had to wait for the United States to form a consensus to elect anything. You know what I mean? We would never get anything done, and it's to some degree unrealistic to expect Puerto Ricans to achieve a level of consensus that we don't see in the political reality of pretty much any country. No?
These past statehood referendums, the choices were, are you for statehood, yes or no? Do I have that understanding correctly? I'm thinking like the past 10 years or so.
Well, a little bit. So actually the first time that we had a statehood yes or no option was 2020. Before, we've had different forms of all the options. So we in 2012, which is a previous one, well, actually 2017 is the previous one, had statehood, independence, and territorial status, and it combined independence and free association as one option. And then before that, what is you had yes, no for the status quo. So you had a first question that asked you if you wanted the status quo, and then the second one asked you if you regardless of your answer on the first one, which is confusing, a lot of people pointed out, would you vote statehood, independence, or free association? So point being that the design of the ballot has changed a lot of times. However, I think something that Andrés kind of alluded to and I mentioned previously, and every single time, regardless of how you framed it, there's been one common thread, and it's always been that regardless of the outcome, the United States has ignored it. Because all these referendums have been organized domestically, and the United States Congress has not recognized any of the outcomes, any of the processes of the referendums, which leads to this whole inactive excuse, we put it, to put it mildly, of the United States to say that, the Puerto Ricans are divided, they haven't reached a clear majority. Well, the fact of the matter is that everyone agrees that they need to change it, but if the United States never declares what it's willing to give or what it requires for an actual acceptance of a decolonial option, regardless of what it is, then nothing's going to happen, because you can't decolonize a colony if the colonizer is not willing to engage in the process.
I appreciate you saying that. I mean, looking at this past 2020 referendum, and I would think as researchers you would appreciate this. You know, if you're trying to take the temperature of where people stand on a particular issue, and you only put one yes or no option in front of them, then you run the risk of people that maybe they just don't like the Commonwealth status. Maybe they just want some type of change. So if you're presenting a change, yes or no, well, not only would you be getting statehood people, is people forced that prefer statehood in your corner, but you'd also get people that just want to change to the status quo. And I think that was really a really interesting data point in your research that showed 83% of Puerto Ricans have a first choice status preference that involves at least some change to the status quo. So, again, when I think of that 2020 referendum, I think, okay, well, you were over 50%. That was the majority. Was the turnout the greatest? No, not necessarily. But of that majority that voted for statehood in that referendum, could you accurately say that everybody wanted statehood as a status option for Puerto Rico as their first choice?
Yep.
And then I believe there was another stat that you all had, that 65% of voters in Puerto Rico have a first choice status preference that is non-colonial, non-territorial. Could you explain what those three options were? And I know you touched on it a bit earlier, but what were those three options?
So here's one thing to give in context of what
Please
non-territorial means, right? Because it's important for Puerto Rico in the way that the United States Constitution is framed. There are states, which we all know what they are. They have their own sovereign power as within the federal system. And then there's incorporated and non-incorporated territories. An incorporated territory is what Alaska and Hawaii were before they became states. Mm-hmm. A non-incorporated territory is what Puerto Rico is, and what some of like the Virgin Islands and Guam, some of the other territories of the United States are, which are under what they call the territorial clause. The territorial clause of the Constitution allows Congress to dispose of anything that happens in those territories. So let's say Puerto Rico passes a law that bans assault weapons. Theoretically, Congress could legislate to undo that law. Same thing for the current status. So Puerto Rico's status of Commonwealth is based on the Federal Relations Act that is an agreement between Congress and Puerto Rico. So the point being that as long as Puerto Rico is within that territorial clause, Congress can do whatever it wants, like impose a fiscal control board on Puerto Rico, or, imagine any law that can happen down 20 or 30 years down the line. So the options where Puerto Rico is not within that clause are only three. Statehood, where Puerto Rico would become a state, right? Like all the other 50 states. Independence, where Puerto Rico would completely separate itself from the United States of America in, maybe a transition process or whatever is agreed upon. And then free association, which is a compact between sovereign nations. So Puerto Rico and the United States would agree on a clear pact of association, but that would be completely outside of the territorial clause, which means that if for some reason the United States were to overstep its authority on Puerto Rico could theoretically change that agreement or in some way, depending on the definition. So the point being that people in Puerto Rico, 65% of Puerto Ricans have a first preference that is either one of those three. And if I remember the numbers correctly, it's like 44% statehood, 15% independence, and about 7-8% free association. So that's pretty significant. 65% of people agreeing on the common thread of not being under the territorial clause is pretty big. That you can't think of any issues in the U.S. or a lot of places that have 65%. Obviously, they differ on what actually is their final conclusion. But the point being is that there's common point of agreement that the current status quo of being a territory is not good. And you mentioned the 83%. So that 83% comes from 17%, I think, more or less, that support what they call an era mejorado, which is a Commonwealth status within the territorial clause usually, but with some enhanced benefits like maybe voting for president like DC does, or perhaps more funding for Medicare and other options that Puerto Rico doesn't have. So this is important to kind of understand, because regardless of how elections have been done in the past, you alluded to it correctly, stated yes or no, or maybe ELA yes or no, kind of hides the fact that even people that vote yes or no on certain things have other preferences that contradict the current status. And therefore, why we thought about a ranked choice voting mechanism, which allows people to express every single preference, right? Because some people prefer statehood and then they prefer independence, right? Some people prefer statehood and then rather than being independent, they'd rather stay at the status quo. And that's important to capture it. And that's why we think ranked choice voting is important, because that way people can express everything and no one can disagree that there's no option included, that no one can disagree on that people weren't able to express those complex preferences in a choice and eventually lead to an actual conclusion to this territorial status, which we all agree is not positive for Puerto Rico.
Trying to see where Puerto Ricans stand on the issue of Puerto Rico status. So you gave them these different status options to vote yes or no on, multiple rounds. I want to say it was two hypothetical scenarios that you all presented to people in this research. So, and again, feel free to jump in, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but on the first hypothetical scenario, you had every option. So statehood, current status, enhanced commonwealth, independence, sovereign free association, or just, I don't want to answer, abstain. Yeah. I don't. And then the second hypothetical scenario had all those same options except for current status and enhanced commonwealth. Correct?
Yeah. So and it's important to point out that we polled before those scenarios. So the beauty of the process is that you don't you don't exclude options before people express their preference, right? Gotcha. When we asked voters, and they didn't know we were going to exclude certain options. That way we don't bias the outcome. Mm-hmm. So what we did was we asked rank 1 through 5 or abstain the options. And then the way it works is once you narrow down options, so let's say we eliminated status quo. So if you voted for status quo, your vote moves to the second option. So if your second option was statehood, your vote moves to statehood. Or if your second option was independence, it'll move so on and so forth. So that allows us to show how it would actually work. So let's say we do ranked choice voting, which is actually part of the Self-Determination Act proposed by Nidia Velázquez and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. If, let's say, the 5 options were there, that the process would work out as we did. But we also did those scenarios to show what if from the beginning status quo was eliminated, you would get something closer to this. It doesn't mean that we would get the exact numbers, because obviously the exclusion of an option changes the choices. But the point being that those scenarios reflect preferences regardless of framing, and then we add the framing afterwards so that there's no bias. So that's the beauty of the ranked choice voting process, because people can show their preferences and it transfers the vote immediately, so that there's no need to kind of have a second election or people being able to shape the ballot in the way they want. So to kind of add to that, what you were saying of the scenarios, the first scenario of eliminating the status quo is what we think the bill is very likely to look at based on political dynamics, because we have independence and statehood and sovereign free association. Those should always be part of a decolonization process, as we discussed. And there's the fourth option, which is the Era Mejorado, which is the one being pushed by the PPD, the Popular Democratic Party, which usually stands for status quo. And that one is still a little murky, but they're trying to include it. So we think that's very likely to happen. However, we also did the other scenario, which we only do preferences of decolonial options, because that's how it could also turn out to be that, the Congress decides, actually, we don't want to add any kind of in-between measures. We want to either keep the status quo and not pass the process, or move completely past it. So that's why we opted to do that. And I think the results are pretty interesting. And I basically show that eventually statehood gets a plurality. Sorry, it goes from a plurality to a majority, because eventually people that either prefer independence or the status quo kind of shift to statehood, depending on how the question is eventually narrowed down.
Yeah, and sorry, Andres, go ahead.
Yeah, no, if I may. So, if I may, I'm going to run down the few scenarios that we have and what the numbers look like.
Great.
And I do want to point to the question you asked earlier, that and re-emphasize that this concept of statehood, yes or no, is extremely new. and it's a new development. It's a new development. It's not the historical position of the PNP. It's in fact originally proposed by the Populares, because they believe that by uniting all anti-statehood options, you would be able to defeat statehood in the same way that the ELA and the territorial status was defeated in the 2012 first question, where 54% voted against the current status, right? So this framing, again, it was originally proposed by the Populares, and then in 2017, we get the 97 number when all the non-territorial, where all the options are included except the Commonwealth, which leads us to the ranked choice voting, which is the closest approach to what has been done historically, while adding an instant runoff. That's de facto what we're doing. Again, in the first scenario, as Giovanni mentioned, we drop current status as what is being currently proposed in the bill. But I also want to emphasize that if you go by pure ranked choice vote and just drop the lowest option, the final result would be the same. Since in the end, in this scenario, you would leave the enhanced Commonwealth in there, and you would drop sovereign free association first, independence first, and they would move regardless to enhanced Commonwealth, and eventually current status would be less popular than enhanced Commonwealth. Regardless, so listing down the first round preferences, and this is purely what voters want, and this is us without dropping any options. So in the first round, we find that statehood gets 44%, enhanced Commonwealth gets 18%, independence gets 15%, sovereign free association gets 6%, and current status gets 17%. So what we forced is the dropping of current status first and leave enhanced Commonwealth there. For the second round, we find that statehood gets to 46%, enhanced Commonwealth gets to 30%. So massive swing from the people who support the current status moving to enhanced Commonwealth. Independence stays at 15%, and sovereign free association stays at 6%. So you get everyone who supports current status pretty much braced towards enhanced Commonwealth, and then two percentage point increase for statehood. After that, we drop sovereign free association. You get a 1 percentage point increase for independence to 16%, 3 percentage point increase to enhanced Commonwealth in the third round to 33%, while statehood gets a 1 percentage point increase to 47%. Lastly, we drop independence, which had 16%. And by this point, 10% goes to enhanced Commonwealth, and 3% goes to statehood, which puts that statehood at 50% versus enhanced Commonwealth at 43%, while 8% of the people would be abstaining by this point. Later in the second scenario that we were mentioning, we forced to drop enhanced Commonwealth, assuming that it isn't successfully defined as a non-territorial alternative, which again is a requirement under the current unity bill, and it's currently in dispute whether we still don't know whether the Populares will be able to put forward a definition that meets this criteria, nor whether this is their goal. So we've seen people such as Aníbal Acevedo Vilá recently say that a recent proposition by the Populares, which called for Puerto Rico not being subject to the poderes plenarios del Congreso, which is the full control of Congress. So they basically want Congress to cede. And Aníbal Acevedo Vilá, former governor of Puerto Rico, and candidate in 2020 for representative, comisionado residente of Puerto Rico, resident commissioner, he interpreted that result to mean that it's non-territorial and that they're proposing a non-territorial alternative, and the Populares will come up with a proposal for their vision of this status in June or July. While other people in the Populares are saying that no, non-territorial inherently means that the ELA isn't an option, and we just want it to not be under, again, the poderes plenarios del Congreso, whatever that means concretely. And we'll find out more in June and July what that option actually looks like, and whether or not it will be able to be included in the ranked choice vote scenario. But in this other scenario, we assume that it is dropped, and as you guys know, this got 43% of all the preferences in the first hypothetical scenario versus the 50% of statehood. And so in this other scenario, again, we start in the first round with 44% statehood, 6% sovereign free association, 15% independence, 18% enhanced Commonwealth, and 17% current status. We drop current status. Statehood goes to 46%. Sovereign free association stays at 6%. Independence stays at 15%. And enhanced commonwealth jumps to 30% once again. No? Then we drop enhanced commonwealth. What happens now is statehood immediately jumps in the third round to 51%, while sovereign free association jumps from 6% to 23%, and independence jumps to 17%. And then lastly, independence gets dropped, and statehood increases to 55%, sovereign free association to 33%. So in this scenario, we would see a pretty clear victory for statehood. And you also have a significantly higher amount of abstentions. You have 12% abstentions in this scenario. So these are the two scenarios that we went through and modeled.
I mean, I'm sure a lot of people listening, Andrés, are going to hit rewind a lot on all those numbers because you give us a really great breakdown. And I think this is why I really like the research y'all did, because I think it really speaks to the nuances and preference that exists on La Isla.
Given the sample size of the poll and, the amount of municipalities that are in Puerto Rico overall, I think it's hard to get that level of insight of this specific municipality is more for this and more for the other. Mm-hmm. So while we did use Senate district information to weigh the results, we don't have that sort of breakdown for this, and whatever breakdown we would have to take it with a grain of salt. Again, because I'm not sure how many people we pulled for Barranquilla, for example, specifically, but just dividing the amount of people we have in the sample by the amount of municipalities, you get a small number. No, there's a lot of municipalities in Puerto Rico, sadly, but based on the 2020 results, I do think you can find some interesting things though, and it's one interesting finding from the 2020 results in the gubernatorial election. We found that the PEEP was over the pro-independence party overperformed, particularly in the San Juan metro area, and performed about as well, just below at the Populares in the San Juan metro area, and the Movimiento Ciudadana coming up right after them. Whereas in the rest of the island, what we saw was that the Movimiento Ciudadana outperformed the PEEP, the pro-independence party. Again, these differences aren't, they're not huge, but it does show to reflect the popularity that Juan Dalmau's candidacy had, especially in with young progressive in the San Juan metro area, which is interesting. And we do have demographic breakdown, which we can get into detail later. But as I mentioned, I think one of the most interesting insights is again the race and Black Puerto Ricans favoring the status quo, and the reasons for that happens with manos a la obra and the material gains that these communities often had during the transformation of Puerto Rico from an agrarian society where many of these people, were descendants from slaves, whether officially or just working with hacenderos, and later gain the benefits from industrialization. Whereas you have more mestizo leaning to less towards statehood than the white identifying Puerto Ricans. And again, whether that means real or if that's self-selection, we can't answer that. But it's still interesting insights in that.
I want to just transition a little bit to the one question we ask all of our guests to end our episodes. What are you both obsessed with right now? It can be related to Puerto Rican culture, not related to Puerto Rican culture. Andrés, why don't we start with you? What are you obsessed with nowadays?
So I was obsessed with basketball.
Okay.
Big basketball fan, big boxing fan.
Are you keeping up with FIBA? Are you keeping up with the Puerto Rican team?
No.
Okay.
No, I'm not. I'm more of an NBA fan.
Okay, all right.
Puerto Rican national team. Andrés Curvelo, he's going to be good though. So once from Illinois, so shout out to him.
Okay, Andrés, man, you're impressing me with your basketball knowledge, sir. Yeah.
But sadly now LeBron's injured, LaMelo Ball's injured. So right now I'm switching and pivoting a little bit, and so I've been listening to a lot of reggaeton lately, trying to see where the reggaeton scenes continues evolving, continues dominating Latin America and the world. So it's always fun to see that grow, go from music that we mostly listen to, in the island, and was very much shunned by the rest of the world, and has taken over and gone mainstream in the United States, has gone mainstream in Europe, and has even gone mainstream in some parts of Asia. So that's another thing that I'm very much obsessed and very much want to celebrate from Puerto Rican culture.
Giovanni, what about you? What are you obsessed with nowadays?
Well, I'm not gonna lie. The person, well, actually, the creature that I'm most obsessed with is my dog Chovy. So Andrés has met him. He is a 1-year-old mixed Chow Chow German Shepherd. He's super happy and exciting. And honestly, during the pandemic has been complete like bastion in our family, because we had a very difficult time with the economy and like my dad's health and everything. So Chovy has been like an obsession that has kept on giving. So we're really happy to have our dog and go run with him. I run with him every morning. So it's nice to have, and I encourage everyone to get dogs. I'm like in New York, I remember everyone having dogs. Now in Puerto Rico, I'm like seeing way more people with dogs. So it's good to go back to hanging out with humankind's best friend.
How can people keep up with you?
Yeah, honestly, for me, Twitter, like follow me at Gio Pagán Vélez, or you can just email me, really, like giovanni.paganveles@gmail.com. You can reach out to us and ask any questions. We're always excited to talk about status, non-status issues, Puerto Rico issues, non-Puerto Rico issues.
Follow me at Andrés Brauer on Twitter. You can also email me at andresbrauer@gmail.com. And I encourage everyone to follow Data Progress at Data Progress on Twitter, which is Data for Progress's Twitter account.
Giovanni Pagán Vélez y Andrés Rodriguez Brauer. Appreciate you both. Thanks for being on the Paseo podcast.
No, thank you for having me.
Joshua. Take care, everyone.